Welcome to the All Inclusive Podcast, a podcast that delves into the world of inclusion from accessibility all the way through to diversity.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, Mike. First I'll start off with a very, very open question. Who is Mike Adam? What is purple and how did it start?
Well, what an open question. So
it is an open one.
Mike Adams is a self-defined disabled person who is what I now call, well, some people call me Mike, some people call me a 17 percenter in terms of I was born with my disability. And I grew up, Ross, like many disabled people, thinking the best way to show the world that disability isn't an issue for me is to do something that was nothing to do with disability. So I spent my entire early days, my education, thinking I wanted to do something that wasn't going to label me disabled. And then I ended up spending my entire career in the disability sector, drawing on lived experience. So I'm chief executive of an organisation called Purple. And quite frankly, what we're about is changing the disability conversation. And by that, I simply mean moving the dial of disability, where traditionally disability has been seen as an issue of charity, vulnerable people, welfare, the responsibility of government, and moving that dial where disability is seen about contribution, about value, about community, and about opportunity. And I guess, like you, life experiences have kind of kicked in and ignited a passion really to ensure that the next generation of disabled people just get a quality of life, quality of experience comparable with their peers. And it's really straightforward, but a mountain to climb in terms of just making it happen.
Yeah, we've got so many similarities actually, because I knew I was dyslexic when I was at school, and I even said it to the teacher, and she said, "No, of course you're not." And I thought, you know what? Hey, I'm cheating the system here. I'm in one of the top sets. So I spent most of my childhood thinking I'm cheating and getting over the fact that I was dyslexic. And then I went through university trying to pretend and cheat the system that I wasn't dyslexic. And then all of a sudden, I do get a final diagnosis when I finish university. And then I spent most of my adulthood going right into the dyslexia and trying to make sure that people don't suffer or have the disadvantages that you had in my generation if you were dyslexic or had that disability.
Let me tell you. Yeah, no. I get it absolutely resonates. Yeah. Let me just tell you a quick story, because my first job after university was to become the disability officer of that university, and it was serendipity. Right. The Funding Council had just announced this massive new initiative to drive disability and disabled students.
What year, if you don't mind asking?
That would have been 1992, I think it would have been 1993.
You don't look old enough, Mike.
I know, absolutely. And but what was really interesting, Ross, is I took on the role.
Yeah.
And very quickly, it was at the time where dyslexia had absolutely come to the fore. And what I absolutely saw in front of my eyes were these students who, quite frankly, had battled their way through the school education system, the further education system, with learning strategies that basically meant we worked 6 hours more than everyone else in order just to keep our head above water.
Yeah.
They came to university, they did a non-heavy written subject, the arts, computers and stuff. Engineering.
Yeah.
And they're all fine until they got to year 3 and they had their dissertation.
Yeah.
And suddenly it hit like a brick wall.
Yeah.
And I remember 78% of the people I supported as disability officer were dyslexic students in the university, over 3/4 of whom had got their diagnosis in their final year at university. So massive congratulations to you for getting through your entire degree before your diagnosis. But it's interesting that that is what happened back then. And we're now, with dyslexia, for example, hopefully in a situation where people getting earlier diagnosis, which means they have a greater choice of the courses that they do at university and not limited to ones where they think they can just about get through without much written coursework.
You've literally described my life, and it's such a strange experience. Actually, it was the same with me. I always had to work harder, and I knew for a fact I used to underperform in exams. But when it come to that crunch point in the third year, when dissertation was thrown in, plus final exams, which were harder, it was very apparent that there was something, where I was severely underperforming. And I was the person that was showing people how to do things in the library, not long, like 2 days before the exam, and they're panicking. And then they would outperform me by 20% in the exams.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, how come the guys that couldn't do it, and I had to show them, get a better mark than me?
Yeah.
No, this is just a strange. And then it just hit us, and I said, look, you need to get this diagnosis, Ross, and the rest, to say, is history. But funny, you described, because I'd done engineering because it's as far away from English as you can get. I thought at the time, until they started putting real world scenarios in. So instead of just asking you equations, it would ask you scenarios with a lot of English and, explanation, where you had to kind of apply engineering knowledge to things that were more English. But a lot of the presentations I used to do in the past was, I used to point to a light and say, I intricately know how that light works.
Yeah.
And I do not want to know. I've had no passion or interest in that whatsoever. It was just the thing that was as far away from English as what I could get.
Yeah. And just the other thing, just while we're talking about dyslexia, by the way, was the absolute, and it goes back to your light example, is the frustration of people with dyslexia who would be called and labelled, suffers from. And I always remember them saying, Mike, yeah, I can see things, I can do things. That part of my brain does stuff that you can absolutely never, ever do. So whatever you think, don't tell me I suffer, because I don't. And it's been really interesting when we're looking today about neurodiversity and the spectrum.
Yeah.
And just the absolute talents and the insights, the knowledge, the details, the recall that these individuals generally, without sweeping statements, generally can have. And they don't see their impairment as suffering, detrimental, disadvantage. It is simply different. And I think one of our messages and one of your messages is that actually all we're presenting is people who are different.
Yeah.
And actually, if you can ensure that difference is equalized by providing the services to enable, then you squeeze the best out of those individuals, whether it's in employment, whether it's in leisure, whether it's in personal, and whether it's in retail, wherever. And I think that's why Purple and Recite Me are absolutely so aligned, because we see the issues through the same lens.
Yeah. And somebody said to me some time ago, it was actually on an interview like similar to this, and they said, what is success to you? Like when you're campaigning, what is success? And I said, when I think success starts to come on the horizon is when these groups don't have to be considered to suffer from or be in a category called a disability.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's just another person, and it's the world that hasn't adapted. So when the world does adapt, it'll just be another person without having to put it into a group or a name or a thing. It'll just be there. I'm there, somebody else is there, and that's the beauty and the diversity of life.
and it's really interesting because when I get asked that same question, I've got a picture of my twins who were 2 at the time.
Yeah.
And we were walking through a park on their 2nd birthday, and there's a picture taken by my partner who was behind us of one of them holding my little stump on an arm, and then the other one holding each other's hands, walking through this park. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. But I say to people, if that picture could come to life and you could pan it out, what you would see is loads of people, adults and children, staring, making comments, being really quite noisy about it. Yeah. And success to me is when people like me can walk through that park and be utterly ignored. So all the presentations, all the work that we do, actually, I think success will be when I get ignored, because I'm needed.
Yeah. And I see parallels like that with when I was president of the student union, a lot of the work the unions were doing at the time with the LGBT, and then the T was added round about my time on what is success for the LGBT community at the time. And it was like walking through a park, through a city centre, holding hands, and nobody even glimmering or even, taking a second glance. Now, 20 years ago, in more progressive places like city centres, that was a thing, but it wasn't more in, the towns and cities and the suburbs surrounding. But now, 20 years later, it has become that thing where, if you walk through a park and 2 men or 2 women holding hands, it's a complete non-issue. So there's been a successful kind of education and campaigning that's been done by the LGBTQ community. And I think I see parallels with, the disability area for yourself. It's you're literally living your normal life and it's invisible because that's normal. I'm, able to go through university without feeling thick, because they just recognize that this part of the society needs to be tested in a different way.
No, and just to say, in terms of our similarities, I was also president of the Students' Union as well.
Which one?
Coventry. I
always think of student unions as what night out did we do in Coventry, and I'm getting hangover. I'm getting hangover memories here from drinking flavored vodkas. We had cherry, chocolate, and we thought it was great at the time, and then we realised we had to drive home the next day. That was Coventry Student Union, by the way.
I'll tell you what, the greatest thing I thought at the time, the greatest thing about being president of the Students' Union was the fact that I could walk into any bar in Coventry and never had to pay for a drink, because they knew who I was and they knew if I was drinking there, I'd bring hundreds of students with me. But actually, it was a fantastic grounding for me in leadership, bringing people along, getting people to understand campaigns and winning hearts and minds over issues. And you talk about LGBTQ. In my early days, I sat with a guy, Ben Summerskill, who was chief exec of Stonewall, who really was fantastic leadership in getting those issues into the public psyche. And like you said, normalizing them. And he said to me one day, where are you heading? And I said, exactly where you have just gone, Ben. So to your point, absolutely.
So if I was to reflect on that, Purple, if you were to say in 5 to 10 years' time, the organisation is a success, what did the organisation look like?
I think we would still be here. And I think it would be naive of me to think we wouldn't be needed. But I think we would be having people knock down our doors and say, we need what you have got. Can you give it to us? Rather than us having to spend all our energy, not quite begging them, but, explaining to them to the nth degree why this was good for them and why they should be making an investment and why maybe they just need to think about putting some money into their budget, because this is about their disabled employees, this is about their disabled customers, and this is about their brand aligned to diversity, inclusion, and disability. So I think that would be where I want to be in 10 years. I think we would like to be global, because I think...
You're very much on the way already.
Well, hopefully. So Purple Tuesday this year was delivered in 5 countries. And my biggest excitement is that we had 60 business leaders at a lunch. Well, I'm not. Can you have a lunch for 60 people? I'm not sure. But there were 60 business leaders in Pakistan who want to lead the agenda on people with disabilities in Pakistan. And, you know, for me, and all the agencies and the governments out there are so excited, because this has been an issue that has been under the radar, you know. And so out of the catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country was underwater only a few weeks ago, and they talk about displacement, they talk about people leaving their homes and going somewhere else. And the reality is, for most disabled people, that's not an option. So they stay with their houses underwater and stuff. So we've been able to shine a light on disability issues through Purple Tuesday. And I think, you know, what we want to do is make sure that for Purple Tuesday, which is about disabled customer, this is a global issue, not just a UK issue. And we talk, Ross, and one of the hashtags for Purple Tuesday last week was a movement moving. And for me, who's been in this world a long, long time, it was like we got the Disability Discrimination Act in 1997.
Yeah.
And that had been what everyone had been campaigning for. And then we all got lost because we didn't know what to do next.
Yeah.
And I think movement moving is there are disabled people and their allies, and that's a really important point, that absolutely are now determined that accessible and reframing accessibility is absolutely critical, and everyone's business. And if I come to Recite Me, you know, 20 years ago, accessibility was about, have we got a lift? Have we got a ramp?
Yeah.
What are we doing for wheelchair users? But actually, if we're not careful, we address those issues, and then the world is now accelerating online at an exponential rate.
Yeah.
And if we're not absolutely careful, we just create a whole set of barriers in the online world for disabled people to have to face, which is why I love working with Recite Me. I love what you do, because we have this opportunity to take down and remove those barriers from day one.
And it's one of the reasons, because I left the student union and I've never actually worked for anybody else, so I'd be terrible to employ. And I started an internet company, and I realized straight away there that the information in the world was getting democratized, as in you weren't in power, and you didn't have to be around power to get a certain amount of information. You just had to go on Google or Yahoo at the time and search it. But this led to a potential problem with people with accessibility problems for information, that they then get left behind. So we do all this work, you know, from the mid-90s, and then all of a sudden, bang, the internet shoots society forward with the democratization of information. But people who've got online accessibility problems can't get access to it. And that was a driver behind why I started this, because it was like, right, are we going to rely on every business coding their website in a certain way and then people buying their software, or if they're lucky, being gifted by the university? This isn't going to happen. In an ideal world, it should, but it isn't. So what can we do with something about this? Well, we should be supplying software that will enable inclusion and accessibility at the source, so the websites themselves. And it's the responsibility for the website owner to make sure their information is accessible. And that, for me, is part of the democratization of information. And we always encourage, build your website in accessible ways, and we don't see ourselves as an alternative. We encourage that, but then we also kind of add the extra layer of inclusivity. And it's been a driving force. And I think, you know, part of the mission, we didn't do any patents. in the early days, even though we were the first to do it. And we've got global competitors now that are loosely based on our technology. And we actually see this as a good thing. It's a bit like Elon Musk, where he was trying to stimulate the growth of electric cars. We're like, look, we want to be the best. We do. That's probably a bit ego-driven by myself, if I'm honest. But we want other people to do it. We want competitors, because if we have competitors, then that means the world is changing and the world is adapting to online, inclusive, accessible information through technology.
Listen, look, two egos are talking to each other, but I think sometimes
two presidents.
Two presidents. Just call us presidents, really. Right?
Yeah, just call Michael. Can you call us president from now on, please?
No, call me Donald. So Donald and Elon.
Yeah.
But in some ways, in all ways, you're absolutely right. We do have egos but actually what we both want is for accessibility to be normalized. Yep. So, to your point, so we are creating what we think is going to be the most accessible marketplace. And interestingly, when we talk to sellers about coming on our marketplace, there is an absolutely clear narrative. And so the first question is, how much is it going to cost us? So if we come on your marketplace, how is that compared with the cost for Amazon, for example, in terms of transaction fees and stuff? And you go, it's going to be exactly the same. Okay, then second question is interoperability. How easy is it for me to get all your products on our marketplace? Because if it's going to take me time and money, then we're not interested. No, we can do it all for you. We've found the magic, etc., etc. And it's only after those two questions have been answered, are they remotely interested in the social impact benefits, what that means to brands? So I can absolutely get, your battles with getting websites, for example, and companies. It does seem perverse to me that what you're selling them is more customers. What you're selling them is an enhanced brand, and you're fighting for them to do this. And then what we're saying is, look, and ultimately, if you then go and do it yourself, you do the recoding, you meet your own AAA standards, which is what's coming down the pike, then that's great. Because to say that you normalize accessibility and online accessibility, we'll find another area that we can develop. But that's brilliant. And I think, in the nicest sense, Ross, that utopia is not going to happen in mine or your lifetime. But hopefully in the next generation, second generation, the generation is going to be less tolerant of accepting suboptimal service, provision, quality, and experience. And I think that is what is going to drive. And someone said to me, and it was really interesting, and I said it at a global webinar, for those that get inclusion, disability, and diversity, this is the decade where they will come out of the decade and they will thrive.
Yeah.
And those that don't will struggle to survive. And I think about the Body Shop and everything that the owner went through in the early days that said, if you don't have environmental credentials, then no one will buy your product. And everyone laughed and said, don't be so stupid. And that's exactly where it is now. And I think the same will happen this decade around disability, diversity, and inclusion. Yeah. And if you can't show your credentials, then the customers will choose other brands.
You've hit the nail on the head. In the early days, we always try to do positivity and courage instead of, the carrot versus the stick, and we would always use the carrot. We knew that people were losing massive amounts of money, but we could never quantify it until the National Car Rental put out the Click Away Pound study.
Yeah.
It was an independent, well-known brand that commissioned something independent that didn't have anybody like ourselves kind of meddling with it. And the figures were staggering. It was 18.4 billion, and keep rising. it keeps rising every year. That was a changing point.
Yeah.
Because the thing that you said to people for 4 or 5 years, you could now quantify through independent means. And you're like, guys, 83% of people who would spend money on your website will go elsewhere if it's not accessible. And that's when the cogs started turning and it started becoming, this is a good thing to do, but this could make us a lot more money. But one thing I realized from me years in the student union, back to student, I think this is going to be a running feature, is that we didn't have a lot of membership services. It was very much a commercial organization. So under the 2 years I was there, we switched it, got a lot of funding from the university and brought a lot of kind of like welfare officers and, the softer side of student unions. And it made me realize then that even just an organization that had 100 staff, how slow it is to turn a tanker.
Yeah.
Even when everything is obvious, how slow things move. And it's like that in the battle that we are with, is that most people you speak to now can see it, but the change in society, because it's so large, just takes time for it to kind of move in the right direction. But the good news is it is moving.
Yeah.
And it's accelerating. And off camera, I was saying to you earlier, Mike, this was just amazing what you did on Purple Tuesdays, because I was liking it. And this, as I said before, that was a symptom of me not getting out the house enough through COVID. But immediately my brain was going back to the events that we used to hold 10 years ago, and the people that kind of, got it. And, there's barriers and this, and they've got to speak to them and they don't know how to get budgets. But all the people that were there and big brands, I mean, you're talking like Boots, and they get it. And then those who get it, supporting it, and they're pushing it. It was eye-opening for me. So the conclusion is you've done an amazing job, and Ross needs to get out of the house more.
Ross needs to definitely get out of the house more. I need to go back into the house and see my kids and partner at some point as well.
Yeah. As I said before, I said you're the busiest man in the world last week.
But how do you move that tanker? Because that's the question, and the answer is Mike and Ross and other disabled people are not going to do it by themselves.
No.
But actually, if you can say eBay is with us, Boots are with us, Asda's with us, SHL's with us, Visit England are with us, Visit Scotland are with us, Tagstar are with us, you suddenly, and what really happens is people and brands that weren't interested suddenly get interested because, well, if Boots are doing it, well, so should we. And you have to, I mean, as a leader, I've had to think, right, there are many different ways to succeed here. And if getting people on board is because they're frightened that their competitors are on board and they're not, and jump on board, then absolutely fine. And I think it will be those brands. Someone WhatsApped me last week on Purple Tuesday, and I won't repeat the expletive, but it was what the something. How did you make it onto the homepage of eBay worldwide? And I went, Purple Tuesday. And in some ways, people will pick up that, they'll read the article and they'll go, I didn't know that. I didn't know the commercial value. I didn't understand the social impact. I thought disabled people, because of the international symbol, I thought disabled people were just wheelchair users, but they're talking about people with dyslexia. They're talking about people with mental health. They're talking about people with cancer. Actually, I know some of these people. I don't want them to not have access. I'll go and do something about it. And it's this movement moving that is, quite frankly, I talk about sometimes conducting the orchestra. And that's all that we can do. And we just get the right musicians who can play the music from different kind of environments come together and make the magic. And it is an allyship of disabled people with lived experience and businesses who are committed for whatever reason coming together that will just move this. And as you said earlier about LGBTQ+, society is also ready for it. And I think if there is one positive legacy of lockdown and COVID is that people are now wanting in their brands to see themselves and recognize fairness, and are not going to tolerate organizations who write one sentence in their annual report or tick 3 boxes and said we're done.
Yeah, I agree. When you were saying that about coming out of lockdown and everything we've been through, the overriding thing I was saying in my head is fairness. The society wants to see a fairer society. I can feel it in my bones.
Yeah.
And I think, we're at the kind of cusp of it. And I like the way you said we're the conductors and the people, the musicians.
Yeah.
The analogy I often use is you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. You don't instigate change, you are the change. And the change happens by all of us being the change and choosing to do the right thing for a fairer society, for people that are open to, for a society that's more open to people that have disabilities, and it doesn't become a group that has to have certain levels of treatment.
Yeah, you'll be pleased to know I need to be the conductor, and I can hold the baton in my teeth with my mouth because I've got no arms, but I need to be because I can't play any musical instruments. I think the penny dropped for me once when my ex-boss, who will remain nameless, but who is now on TV every night of the week that I turn it on. And he said to me once, he said, look, Mike, let's be really clear. We are not umbrellas. We are people who are going to change the weather. I thought, wow, that's big sky thinking. And I think that's what Purple and Purple Tuesday, we are about changing the weather.
That's brilliant. And you know what? I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast. So this has been genuinely fantastic. I'd like to thank you for the time, and I look forward to catching up, having a beer and talking about some old student union stories.
That sounds absolutely brilliant, but I'll replace the beer with the red wine, but I'll still buy you a beer. That'd be great.
No, I don't drink beer myself now because I'm gluten-free. So I'm actually red wine as well. I look forward to it, mate.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks for your time. Take care.